Welcome, everyone. It's been a while. I have not done one of these YouTube conversations for about a month, and I've missed them because I get to talk with amazing people like Tom here. So I'm just going to introduce Tom before I give the mic to him so that you know who he is and a little bit more about the amazing things that he's doing. I can't remember the exact context in which we met, but it feels like we've been seeing each other's work for quite a while now, and I've always been intrigued by what Tom does. So, to give you an example of what he does, he's a best-selling breathwork author and innovator, and I'd say that that's really true, the innovator word. He is on a mission to create engaging new ways to empower people to unlock the potential of their breath. Now, this is where I came across Tom. His best-selling book, Draw Breath, The Art of Breathing, which is really beautiful, by the way, highly recommended, has now been translated into 9 languages and has received multiple literary awards for its creativity and effectiveness in reducing anxiety. So Tom's approach to breathwork has been praised by leading experts in the yoga and meditation fields, from James Nestor, who wrote a fantastic book, Breathe, to Jon Kabat-Zinn. And his passion for breath work is what led him to create both the book and his similarly named YouTube channel, Draw Breath, where he interviews many of the world's leading experts in the science and practice of meditation and breath work. I love the fact that Tom goes off traveling all around the world to meet and talk to these people. So his latest project, Aria Breath, the musical meditation, we will cover in today's talk, so I'm not going to go into that so much now. But Tom's breathwork sessions are always fun, in my opinion. They're always an exploration, and I always find something new. So all the rest of it you will find in the bio notes for today's episode, along with where you can find Tom, which is in many, many places. Tom, welcome.
Steph, thank you so much for having me. It is always such a pleasure. Whenever I'm seeing your face, it's generally something fun happening.
The older I get, the more I think that fun is really, really, really important because just before we came on air, and maybe this is where we can start, we were actually talking about how a lot of conscious connected breath work, which is what I teach, as you know, and in part what you teach, has a strong focus on trauma release. And whilst I feel that that's very necessary and incredible, what can come to the surface and come to the light through connected breath, we can get a little bit stuck in those places. And so maybe we can start by speaking to that. What's your perspective on that through your work?
Sure, I actually have a model to help people understand this because I think what you've kind of isolated there is the breathwork can be this incredible enjoyment, but also it can sound a little bit scary with things like trauma release, these kind of words getting used. And the breath work that uses conscious connected, that uses circular breathing, that I'm drawn to is vivation, which was created by Jim Leonard in the 1970s, kind of an offshoot from rebirthing initially, and then he developed his own way of approaching it. And the whole point of it is enjoyment. Like there's 3 stages to the process, and the third is enjoy it as much as you can. And from my understanding of how this works, I give people what I call the 3 R's. And so there's 3 R's in the relationship between breathwork and emotion, or how I see this anyway. We can use breathwork for emotional release, which is what we're doing in things like holotropic breathing, where things are coming to the surface and being allowed out. We can use it for emotional regulation, which is with, as you know, my passion project, Aria Breath, coherent breathing, resonance frequency breathing. We're actually helping the nervous system to enter more restorative states and get better at doing so. But the third R is resolution. So actually using breath work to bring this stuff to the surface, but actually use radical acceptance and awareness and compassion to integrate it into our experience. So we probably got way into the technical terms, into the weeds straight away there, into our conversation. But I think that it really helps to understand that the differences that confuse people with breathwork, because I think so many people come to breathwork from a big experience like Wim Hof that they've never had before. And they go, what was that? And they're trying to understand the experience. And so, like you mentioned there in my bio, I'm always looking for new ways of not just helping people to experience breathwork, but to understand its potential as well through language. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful for your listeners.
Yeah, I think it's actually really important what you've just pointed to there, because the majority of people who come towards our training, for example, with inquiries, get really confused about all the different kinds of breath work that there are out there. And as you say, you could go to Wim Hof session or a Soma session or a holotropic session, or you could go to a nervous system regulation session. It's all breathing with intention, pranayama, in through yogic practice, but all with very different outcomes, very different results for different lengths of time. And for many people, I think it's not surprising that we have an initial unusual experience, say. Let's say that I prefer that term rather to shocking, because for some people it is a bit like, what just happened? What did I experience? And it's unusual because we don't always make the time and the space to actually tune into what's going on in our inner worlds. I think for me, that's one of the great values of the Aria breath. So let's talk a little bit about what Aria breath is and why that matters to you.
Yeah, so Aria Breath is my main project at the moment. You mentioned that I'd done the book Draw Breath a couple of years ago, which was all about drawing in time with your breathing and completing different pictures, kind of like a coloring book, but with your breath, using the breath waves. And following that creative vein, Aria Breath is using music to guide the breath. So still using art in a way, but using music this time. And I think most of your listeners will have heard of coherent breathing by now, or resonance frequency breathing. And these terms are used interchangeably, although they are slightly different. Essentially breathing between 5 and 6 breaths per minute for an extended period of time. So slowing the breath right down, because normally we're breathing around 12 to 20 breaths per minute. Slowing it right down to this essentially magic frequency of 5 and 6. And what happens is we alter a lot of our body's biorhythms, but in particular, heart rate variability. So we start to create major differences in our heart rate variability when we do this, which over time actually increases heart rate variability. And with that, it's demonstrating that it's actually enhancing areas of our nervous system that help us to feel safe, calm, and connected to other people. But it's quite a boring practice, breathing at 5 or 6 breaths per minute. And just like mindfulness, if you don't have a guide, you can get distracted and just forget what you're doing and just start thinking about your shopping list. Now, what happens when you add music is that it becomes not only easier because you have that music to pace your breathing, but it also becomes really enjoyable because you have now options for how you're practicing. You can use the music in a healing way as well. So using really calming, really beautiful music or binaural beats within the music. And so the inspiration came, as I know we've discussed this before, but for your listeners, Stephen Elliott is the guy who coined the phrase coherent breathing in the early 2000s. And he had a track called Two Bells. And I was obsessed with Stephen's work and obsessed with Two Bells for about 2 years, breathing to it pretty much every day. And I realized that there's, I wanted to have variance and choice in what I was breathing to. And so I ended up enlisting a few musicians to help me to create lots and lots of different pieces of music. And I was also at the same time researching for a book called Breathe in Harmony, that's my follow-up book to Draw Breath, which is all about slow rhythmic breathing. And I had this idea to create an audiobook that people could listen to a chapter on the science and the stories and history of the breathing technique, then do maybe a 30-minute practice with the music, then more science, then more music, then more science, and have it kind of like those books that were really popular on mindfulness a few years ago, where they integrate the practice into storytelling and science. But I realized that no one's going to buy a book with a CD player in it. And so, with a CD in it, sorry, because no one has a CD player. And so I decided to create an app where people could download and listen to the music. And that's what Aria Breath is. So it's hundreds of pieces of music, slightly different speeds within the resonance bandwidth, of around five, so pacing your breathing around 5 or 6 breaths per minute. And there's also some courses in there, the interviews with the scientists that I did to research the book. And so, yeah, it's hard to describe what Aria breath is because it keeps expanding what it actually is. But the word Aria means both song and air in Italian. So it's about combining music with breathwork, basically, for really deep uh, and long-term benefits. Because the more you do this, the more you heal those parts of your nervous system that control your heart rate, the
Mm.
more you actually heal the parts of your nervous system that can make you feel safe.
Yeah.
And the project launched in January this year, I think, and it's been like in a pre-launch since then. Um, and I was not sure whether people would be interested, whether it was just my obsession that was just a kind of pipe dream. But it's been a real success. You know, we've got 300 and nearly 400 members now. Um, I've trained 100 new teachers in how to actually use this music. So other breath workers from different breathwork modalities who are keen to use the music but not quite sure how, they come to do the license training with me. Um, but the most incredible thing to me has been the emails that I'm getting from people about how effective it's been. Because when we spoke last, last time I saw you was actually the Airheads event that me and Mike Mayer did, and you came and did an amazing session. And by the way, yours was my mum's favourite session at the event.
Come
And
on, Tom's mum.
but before that, we were talking. I think last I can't remember, but it was around the Shift Network,
Mm.
and around that time it was still in the pre-launch phase, so I wasn't sure whether people would, gravitate towards it, like it. Um, but the feedback has been amazing. Like the first, it takes about 5 weeks for this to have transformative effects. It's different from conscious connected breathing, which I know a lot of your listeners are really big fans of, where you have an immediate breakthrough a lot of the time with it, or you have something rise to the surface that you can integrate or whatever it might be. This is more subtle. It's more like doing squats every day and then suddenly you're really strong and you
Mm.
don't have so much tiredness around walking. With this, people generally build their resilience over about a 5 or 6 week process. And in the 6th week after it had been launched, a guy emailed me, and I've asked him if it's okay for me to share this story. So it's completely confidential who it is. But they emailed me to let me know that they'd been having night terrors. They had PTSD. They'd been having night terrors for 7 years, almost every night, every other night at least. And after doing this for 6 weeks, their night terrors had stopped. It'd been their first 7 days in a row without night terrors. And they weren't interviewing me to say how amazing. They were saying, what has happened, capital letters, like how is this possible? And it's because even though we talk about heart rate variability as a benefit of this, what the heart rate variability is really demonstrating is that we're changing the nervous system. And our perception of safety around us is happening in the nervous system. And our perception of safety, how safe or not unsafe we feel, is really moderating our ability to feel connected to our environment, to other people,
Yeah.
to whatever it is that we're feeling and thinking. And so that's what makes this practice transformative. And I have a different name for it than coherent breathing, because that's Stephen's very specific way of practicing, and a different name from resonance frequency, because a lot of the time we don't know if we're on the exact resonance frequency. So I've started calling this harmonic breathing,
Mm.
harmonic breath work, I should say, because what we're doing is creating harmony within the body by breathing in harmony with music. So it's specifically using rhythm and music. Um, and I don't want to tread on the toes of Stephen or of Evgeny Vashilo, who came up with the word resonance frequency, because there is subtle differences between these things. So in case people are wondering why I'm throwing that term around, that's why. It's rather than appropriating anyone else's technique, it's actually because I have a deep respect for the differences in their techniques, and I wouldn't want people to get the wrong idea about coherent breathing or resonance frequency from coming and learning what I'm doing.
Thank you, Tom. I love everything that you frame there. I love the integrity around the fact that you've been inspired by those things. I just actually used Stephen Elliott's two bells at retreat this weekend, and people just in one session were just going like, "Wow, what just happened?" So I I mean you are an innovator. You're going to be one of those people who's on the names of the lips of people in 50 years time going, "Oh yeah, and then there was Tom Granger who founded XYZ." I really believe that. And I want to just speak for a moment to people who've got less experience of breath work because I think this creates confusion for people. When we talk about heart rate variability, oftentimes people think that if you are getting what we call an increase in heart rate variability, they'll be like, oh, but I don't want that. Isn't that like arrhythmia? Or when you're getting irregular heartbeats. But no, it is exactly like you've described. It's like working that muscle so that you can learn to self-regulate and calm down, because the example you gave before about people get distracted and you might be thinking about your shopping and the music helps. When we know we're getting really good at these practices is when we can think about our shopping or be doing our shopping, but still regulating using the practices. And, having just got back from multiple tests at the doctors after getting back from Africa with all sorts of stuff going on, as they were measuring like my breathing and my heart and all those things, they were like, "Oh, this is really good." And I was in better condition than I was like, 10 years ago, much better, significantly, with things like cholesterol going down, with things like other stuff going down. And I'm like, yeah, don't drink
Mm.
alcohol, don't smoke, practice coherent breathing, etc., etc. So, do you want to add anything to that about those, why the heart rate variability is a good thing?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for your very flattering comments there. I'll do my best to create something that has that longevity. Um, so I can explain a little bit about the why this does affect heart rate variability. That's probably helpful to because that will help explain why it improves it. Because what's happening is every time we're breathing in, we're obviously creating a vacuum in our lungs that's drawing air into the body, but we're also lowering the pressure around the heart. And so the heart actually has to speed up to deal with that. And then as we breathe out, we're actually increasing the pressure on the heart because that vacuum's no longer there. And so that's making the heart slow down. And you can actually feel that. If you start breathing slowly and you feel your pulse, you'll start to notice that. It's called respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And it happens naturally all the time. But what happens when we breathe in this specific speed, of around 5 or 6 breaths a minute, so not quite specific, but in that specific bandwidth, okay? What happens is the as we change the heart rate, it's correspondingly changing the blood pressure. And when these two things are kind of perfectly out of phase, because there's a bit of delay in that actually happening, the two signals end up pushing each other higher and higher. It's a bit like how I explain this is like two kids on a trampoline. If you have two kids on a trampoline, one's bouncing, he's just doing this. What happens is if they bounce just out of phase, right, they both end up going really, really high. And that's what's happening. We start to make it so that the blood pressure is just lagging behind the heart rate slightly, and that's pushing the heart rate. And what that means is the heart rate gets higher and lower with each breath, even more so than it ordinarily would with normal slow breathing. So when we're in this exact bandwidth. Every time the heart rate slows down, it gets better at doing so. So with each breath, we're essentially doing a press up for the heart's ability to relax. And so that's why it gets stronger. The parts of the nervous system that are controlling that get stronger. And the part of the nervous system that is most engaged in that is the ventral branch of the vagus nerve. So this is something yoga teachers like to talk about a lot. The vagus nerve is depending on how much time we have to go into polyvagal theory, something that's unique to mammals. And we have it because it downregulates a lot of the other threat responses, like freezing, like fighting and fleeing. And when the vagus nerve when there's a lot of information traveling on it, we're more likely to be in a socially coherent state. We're more likely to be socially engaged. And so by improving the health of that nerve with every slow out breath, we're actually improving our ability to feel safe, as I mentioned earlier, but also be socially engaged. Now, something that's actually come out in recent months, so since we last spoke about this, Steph, and I told you some of the benefits there at the Shift Network, there's been an amazing study that came out by a lady called Professor Mara Mather. And I was told to look out for this study by a guy called Dr. Richard Gevirtz, who's one of the people to be studying this in the 90s. I spent about 4 hours talking to him last year as part of the research for this, and he was like, you need to watch out for what this Professor Mather is doing, because it's going to blow everyone away. And it did blow me away. So this study came out in February. They're repeating it now with slightly different parameters, and I think it's going to come out again next year. But what she demonstrated was, they've been studying this technique for years now, since the early 2000s, with music, without music, with biofeedback, without biofeedback, all these different variations. They kept showing that it improves heart rate variability. They also kept showing that it would decrease depression and decrease anxiety. And we now, from this conversation, understand a little bit why it might do that, because we're increasing the ability to feel safe, we're increasing the nervous system's resilience, but there was no evidence for it in the brain. So it's this combination of, we've got this one metric of HRV, and then this qualitative reports that people feel less depressed, people with PTSD, their score is lowering in that. How can this be? What's happening in the brain? And so Mara Mather took over 100 people, put them, well, her and her team, I should say, put these people through an MRI machine. So it's looking at their brain activity, which are the size of different areas of the brain. And then they got them to do this breathwork for 6 weeks. They did it for 20 minutes twice a day. But I think that this next study might show that you don't need quite that much. It might only be 20 minutes a day. And what they demonstrated was that not only did the people report feeling less depression and anxiety, but the part of their brain that's responsible for happiness, which is just above your left eye, which is called the left occipitofrontal cortex, gets bigger. So this is a part of your brain that gets smaller when you're depressed. In just 6 weeks of doing this breathwork, it got bigger. It's also involved in emotional regulation. It's involved in all kinds of things to do with emotion. And so they finally have this hard evidence that what we're doing with this kind of breathwork is changing fundamentally the shape of your brain, especially in the areas to do with emotional self-regulation and happiness, basically, in simple terms. The other thing that is so amazing about this study, and for 6 months after this study, no one was talking about it. None of the major news outlets were talking about this, which is insane when you consider how far-reaching the implications are. And then finally, only last week, the BBC had it on their news website.
Oh.
And that is that what Amara's team discovered was that when you do this breathing technique for 6 weeks, something called amyloid beta in the brain gets less. So the people who did do the breathwork technique, they had less amyloid beta in their brain than the people who didn't, and theirs went up.
Right.
Why this is fascinating is because amyloid beta is associated with Alzheimer's disease.
Oh, okay.
And so what we're essentially doing is, now the causal relationship is unknown, but it's pretty well understood to be very associated with Alzheimer's. And there is no drug that can minimize it. So this is breathwork once again doing something that drugs and traditional pharmaceutical medicine cannot do. And the implications of that are major, because everyone needs to protect their brain health over time. And interestingly, this is actually something that Stephen Elliott predicted, and he told me this two or 3 years ago. He said, I think that what we're going to see is people showing that this essentially cleans the brain. And at the time I thought, what is this guy talking about, right? But what's happening is, when we're creating that vacuum in the lungs, we're also creating a vacuum at the back of the lungs. And your brain's in essentially a sack that's filled with, let's call it brain oil, right? That keeps it healthy. It's actually called cerebrospinal fluid. And it goes halfway down the spine, actually almost 2/3 of the way down the spine. When we breathe with the diaphragm, we're starting to move that fluid a bit more. And so what it's doing is helping to circulate that brain cleaning fluid. So we're literally brainwashing people. And that was my understanding of it, but Mara Mather explained it's even more subtle than that. So that might be one element of it, but actually it's just, we're reducing the amount by allowing for these moments of peace throughout the day, which our breath can achieve in a way that mind and meditation can't alone, especially for beginners. We end up giving the brain a break where it can just clean itself. So the inflammation all goes down. We're producing less rubbish in the brain. There's less sort of waste, and it actually has the opportunity to clean itself, which looks like it's going to protect your brain health in the long term,
I think this
which
is
is
so
just
important.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really, really important, and I'm so glad you brought it in. And I want to make clear here for anybody listening, because obviously they know what I teach and how I work, that we are now here talking about coherence breathing and not conscious connected breath, because the conscious connected breath also imparts quite significant physiological changes, which therefore can influence psychological change, etc., etc. And there's still a lot to be learned about what that is and what that does. So I'm very clear these days that I don't say to people, go and do conscious connecting breath work for 30 minutes every day. Absolutely not. But go and do coherent breathing or harmonic breathing for, 10 minutes a day, as you say. And it's just incredible that this very free, readily available resource that we've got can do so much for us when people don't realize, and it's like, as I say, the evidence was there for me in my markers today. It's like, well, I want to do everything I can to protect my future health. And I say to my children, if you have to look after me because I get something unexpected, so be it. But if you have to look after me because I've neglected to take care of my own health, I wouldn't feel so good about that. And everything I do, I see now, especially in my sixth decade, as an investment in my future health, whether that be brain health, heart health, or anything else. It's the more awareness that we have these kind of resources there for us, the better.
Mm,
Like, who
mm,
wouldn't want to just increase all these things and create a better sense of connection in the world, because we're bombarded all the time by so much stimulus now that most people have stepped outside of that ventral vagal connection
mm.
into reactivity, into overwhelm, into burnout, and all of these things that we're seeing coming in more and more and more. And we're hit by stuff that we still don't know how it's impacting us in terms of radiation and diet and food chain and chemicals, processed foods, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm with you there, and I'm becoming more of a hippie each year in terms of that stuff. Like, I was totally against the whole 4G, 5G, Bluetooth thing, thinking, nah, that's a load of rubbish. And now more and more people keep sending me stuff, and I'm like, okay, maybe, yeah, okay, should I even have an app? All this stuff, and
Everything in moderation,
you
Tom.
you know my friend Mike Mayer, and he's so keen on grounding now. So I'm doing barefoot walking every day and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm with you. We need to find as many ways as we can to live more naturally, and I
Yeah.
really believe that the slow breathing thing. I should mention as well, you said that, just to be clear, that's not conscious connected that Tom's talking about, it's the coherence. It's also, just to be clear, that study was done with biofeedback. So they were looking at their heart rate as it was changing.
Yeah.
And the next study is going to demonstrate whether or not you need that element of it. And I strongly predict, and so does Mara Mother, that that won't happen.
Can you clarify that? I missed the point
So,
there. So
so,
they
so
predict that what won't happen.
but basically, biofeedback is wherever we're looking at feedback live from the
Yeah.
body,
Yeah.
and seeing if we can moderate it in some way using conscious control. And what you can do with HRV is hook yourself up to a monitor that shows your heart rate changing. And so what these people were doing, they were trained to breathe in time in such a way that would create this HRV. It's essentially a way of them discovering their resonance frequency, which again is around 5 or 6 breaths per minute for 99% of people. And what they're going to do in the next study is do it with a pacer, so using sound. They're not using music; they're using tones to pace. And obviously, if that comes through saying that it's doing this, then it's amazing for everyone who's been practicing with Aria breath. So it basically evidences that they'll have been having these effects themselves. So yeah, the I can't remember what your last question was now before I got sidetracked.
No, I can't either. But actually, I'm kind of, you just said something there that brings in this quality of sound, because there has been so much study that's been done on the effect of sound. We are 70% or more water. frequencies are carried through our body with sound. And when you look at harmonics and you look at how sand moves in certain situations with different frequencies, we go, well, of course that's happening in us. You know, we're not separate from nature. We're not separate from everything that moves around us, that's in our energy fields. So I'm curious to also know what influence the sound has separately and together with the breath. Yeah.
Well, it's a really interesting thing because I think with sound healing proper, I'll call it. So when you're doing it with someone and they're playing an instrument or they're using bowls, that is an incredibly powerful thing because the frequencies are right there. They're live. There's an element here where the musician is their intent behind it. I think is important as well that you're probably not getting with the music with Aria breath because you're listening to it with headphones usually, or you're listening to it on a speaker. It's not got that same effect on your body. You know, I've had sound healing done where a guy's literally playing a didgeridoo into my heart, you know, and having sound bowls put on me and things, and it is a totally transformative and totally different experience. With Aria breath, what we're doing is creating music that's deeply relaxing. And so it's having that effect on your nervous system, but from the inside out, where it's your breath that's creating the resonance. Now, having said that, I'm talking to a number of musicians at the moment who are interested in the project about combining those two things, so that there's always a part after the breath work with Aria breath where you're just guided to just relax, no worries to control the breath anymore, just allow it to for the experience to sink in essentially and integrate. And I think that's a point where I would see sound healing being really powerful because we've cleared out so much just from doing the rhythmic breathing, and now just allowing somebody else to help you would be incredibly powerful.
I mean, thank you for explaining that. And I think what all of this points to for me is something that is hugely important that we often forget about, which is integration. So, we can go and do any of these practices. We could sit and meditate for 10 minutes. We could sit and do coherence breathing. We could do a connected breathwork session. But if we're not then kind of either cultivating those practices or allowing the time for the integration of what we notice and feel in the body, we're constantly externalizing things and seeking answers from quick fixes, which I think, again, we've got very used to. So I want to just say to people, don't get disheartened and don't give up. Like you quoted the 5 or 6 weeks, which isn't very much in the grand scheme of things. And there are some things that we can do and elicit changes with. You talked about grounding and natural living, which is, again, this retreat that we were just on is a place where Tony Riddle often goes, who's really known for his work, the natural lifestyle of coming back and sitting on the floor more and not having shoes on so much and bringing in these practices like cold exposure, regulating breathing, sleep hygiene. Huge, huge. I'm only just realizing quite how huge that is. And oftentimes it's unlearning what we've learnt and then getting rid of skepticism, whether it's about 5G, which you've just named, or whether it's about the fact that our breath can actually do so much to influence our healing. And I think it's hard sometimes because they are invisible things that we can't always get that biofeedback on. But ultimately we'll go, oh, hang on a minute, I took a pause there. I was able to create some space before reacting. I was able to self-soothe and say, it's okay, it's all right, it's all going to be all right. Just take a breath, calm down, etc., etc. So I love that we're bringing all of this into today's talk. And I'd love to ask you, knowing how much you traveled and adventured, and knowing that you have that geeky, nerdy part that's just like, I want to talk to you and you and you, and look at this research. And there's so much more that you can learn about the work that Tom's done, by the way. So when I put your links below this show notes, go check him out. But what's really occupying you and inspiring you at the moment, assuming that you're not traveling all over the place again, which you might be actually, I don't know.
So I went the trip that you're referring to was last year, so last April or something like that. I went and did the research for the Breathe in Harmony book. That's become the app, and I was talking to scientists all over America, so especially on the West Coast, but also in New York and Texas as well, where a lot of this research is being done. Um, and I recorded all those interviews, and they're available inside the app. They'll eventually be available in on YouTube once I've done some YouTube style editing to them. And I went back this year to go and stay with somebody I met on that trip, which is Paul Hughes from Vivation International, which is one of the oldest breathing organizations that comes from the Conscious Connected school of thought. So they're kind of began in 1979. I think the only ones before them are the Rebirthing school that was set up by Leonard Orr. So really historic school, and they'd kind of gone dormant basically for about 5 years, which just so happened to be when all this breathwork stuff was happening, getting really popular. And so me and a couple of other people came together to help Paul to bring it back, around, and just work on some of the teaching methodology, some of how it's shared. And I went back this year to stay with him in Wyoming, and we worked together for about 6 weeks in March and April on it. And that's what I'm working on this morning in the background, because there's the first teacher training retreat to happen in America for about 5 years or something. It's happening in October. So just doing some prep for that. Sadly, I can't go, which is really frustrating because I'd really love to be there. But there's going to be another few trainings next year that I'll be able to go to. So what's occupying me literally right now is that. So working on teaching standards, and luckily, because I've been working on the Aria breath teacher standards and all of that stuff, that's been very helpful. It's been a very symbiotic process. But you know me, I'm always working on like 5 or 6 different projects, which I'm not sure I recommend. For me, it's a kind of thing where I get stuff done, where I'm procrastinating on a different project than I should be doing, and then I finish that project. So that's what works for me. But yeah, Vivation's been a big learning curve for me the last few years. And then after this training's complete in October, it will be going back to the Aria breath teach training. So right now I'm just training people on how to use the music itself. So this is mainly for people who already have a breathwork modality that they're using, whether it's conscious connected, or I've had people from Alchemy, people coming from Patrick McEwen, who want to use music in their sessions but aren't sure how. And so what that training does, it allows you to use the music from Aria Breath Library in public and with your clients and all that kind of stuff. That's been amazing and really inspiring. And I've learned so much from having to go through that process of what the teachers need to know, because I'm so used to teaching the general public about breathing. And it's a very different job and responsibility to teach teachers, I'm sure. Well, I know that you know, Steph, because we were talking about it before we came on. But it's been something I've really enjoyed. And so I'm deepening what that will be for next year, so that the Aria Breath system will be much more complete, with movements, with a journey that you can take people on as a teacher over 6 weeks, which is roughly how long it takes to have that impact. And so lots of things going on. Obviously still working with Mike Mayer on the Airheads project, which is more for the general public, but a very fun way of learning about breathwork for people who've just come to the practice and they're really trying to understand it. We really take a step back. We try and teach as many different styles. We try and integrate brilliant teachers like yourself, Steph, from around the world to come and speak on their expertise in online events, and hopefully share practices. And that's been really rewarding as well this year. We did a week-long online retreat in, gosh, can you remember what it was? April, end of April?
Was it? I thought it was earlier than that, but it might have been April. Are you doing another
Maybe,
one?
maybe it was early April. We're going to talk about doing it again next year. Now, whether we could get the same level of guests that's the big question, because we got everyone we wanted this year, Steph, including you. So it's like, oh, where do we go from here? Would it be maybe more introducing some newer people into it, or those conversations are kind of happening right now for what we may do in the
I
coming
hope you
months.
do, because I think you and Mike bring together a really lovely energy, a combined energy, and I can only see you getting more and more speakers, perhaps some of those that you didn't have before, that relate to some of the things that we've been talking about today. I can see that happening very easily. And just before we close, taking it right back to the beginning. So for people new to breathwork breathing who kind of go, what do you mean I can influence my heart rate or lower my blood pressure or improve my nervous system responses? Like, what would be the one thing that you would recommend to them as a starting point?
Well, this is very biased and selfish, but if they were to go to my website, ariabreath.com, and put their email in there, I send out a free starter pack, which has a very, very easy to understand guide for best practice, some music that you can download and breathe along in time with,
Mm.
and some animations just to make it fun and visual, where you can guide the animations are very beautiful and hypnotic, and they guide your breath as well. So if you want to know a bit more about where I've been, how I've got to this point, and most important parts of the practice, then that genuinely is the best place I can recommend you going, because it's the stuff that I know to be correct and based on evidence. So I
Mm.
hope your listeners do go and check that out, and they're very welcome to.
Thank you, and I'm really glad that you mentioned that. It's very generous of you, and I know how thorough you are in what you've just mentioned there, the evidence base that for many people is really important because we work in a world anyway where healing is typically undervalued or might be considered woo woo. So I think the more that we can bring in this important unity between the science and the evidence, but also not closing ourselves off from the mystical and the unknown, because that is the basis after all of many breakthrough discoveries, is those
Mm,
moments of like, whoa, where's that come from? Shh,
yeah,
Einstein and electricity and Tesla and XYZ. It didn't really necessarily come from just hours and hours and hours of mulling over scientific papers. They were
absolutely.
innovators like
Yeah.
yourself.
Well, I think
I
a
just
really
likened you to Einstein and Tesla.
you really shouldn't do that. The a good maybe closing thought in terms of what you've just said is a story that was told to me by Richard Gevert, who I mentioned earlier, who's one of the really early people to be researching this. And he told me that when in the 90s, late 90s, when they were looking at this, there's a couple of researchers researching the same thing, which is this phenomena of how breathing interacts with heart rate and increases heart rate variability. And all of them started to look at ancient practices. So Evgeny Vashilo, who's really the first person to observe this phenomena, he started looking at Qigong practitioners.
Hmm.
Um, his colleagues, Paul Lara, he was looking at Zazen monks in Japan. Richard was looking at yogi practitioners. And they had another colleague in Italy um, called Luciano Bernardi. He was looking at Tibetan monks. And because they all knew about each other's research, they were like, well, let's just ask these monks to breathe, you know, in whatever way will, I can't remember the exact phrase that they used, but it's something like, breathe in whatever way allows you to feel calm, alert, and present. And all of them would slow down their breathing to the resonance frequency. None of these monks knew each other. They weren't even from the same modality. They just knew from an embodied place that that's how you breathe to achieve this. They didn't know the science. When the scientists said, oh, so you're doing that because of the thing in the heart? No, we're just doing this because this is what connects us to spirit. So it's like, oh my God, that's just so important to understand that I as a Westerner need the science before I'll believe it. But actually, these people are doing it for thousands of years just from embodiment alone. So yeah.
When you know, you know. I love that. I really love that. What a beautiful note to end on. So, I just really want to thank you, Tom, for bringing in your gentle presence and your grounded knowledge base. And yeah, just it's
Well,
always a
Steph,
pleasure to chat.
thank you so much for inviting me. I've been looking forward to seeing you, and we'll definitely catch up again soon.
Yeah, hopefully before a year has passed. So go check out Tom in the links that we put below, and you can discover more about his incredible work. I really hope as many people go and find out exactly how powerful the breath can be in the most simple ways. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Steph.